to Looking Back, Looking Forward, where we sit down with experts for an in-depth discussion of an historical event that shaped Canada in important ways. These conversations are integral to our mandate at the History of Social Change to explore our unique history through the lens of social change, with the belief that we must look back in order to look forward, that we cannot understand who we are today without knowing and learning from our past. Today, we're exploring the Canadian labor movement, with the backdrop being the 150th anniversary of the 9-hour movement and the adoption of the Trade Unions Act. For some very brief background, between January and June 1872, workers in Canada took to the streets to demand shorter working hours in what became known as the 9-hour movement. Though history largely views the movement to have been a failure, it did lead to some change. The federal government of John A. Macdonald, for example, introduced the Trade Unions Act in June 1872, Canada's first labor law, which gave workers the legal right to form unions. To commemorate the anniversaries and explore the labor movement more generally, we have with us 3 prominent guests. Patrick Johnson is the Secretary-Treasurer at UFCW 1518, which is United Food and Commercial Workers Union 1518, representing over 26,000 members across British Columbia and the Yukon. Rob Christopherson is a professor of history at Wilfrid Laurier University, who specializes in Canadian labor history, the history of capitalism, and public history. He is also the president of Wilfrid Laurier University Faculty Association. Siobhan Vipond is Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress. Welcome to you all. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to jump right into the questions because I have one that I was just so curious about. Often we have guests on and we wonder, like, what about your history? Never mind the actual history of the commemorative events that we're talking about. I don't want to spend a whole hour on this, although I'm sure you all could, because you all have such very interesting and unique histories. But I was wondering what we can sort of go around to each of you if you want to answer. What got you involved in the labor movement? Like, everyone has such a, the reasoning might be different or might be very similar. I'm curious. What got you there? Who wants to start? Rob, you look like you want to start.
I think I was 17 and I got a job as a security guard guarding the bulk mail sorting facility in Hamilton. And none of the workers would talk to me, and they actually seemed kind of angry at me. And I was very confused. I had no idea what was going on. And finally, a couple of them came up and said, "You know why they hired you, right? We're going to have a strike." And of course, I didn't really know what that meant, but I knew it was bad, that I had been hired for that reason. And from that point on, I started to think about these things. So by the time I got to university, I started studying these things. I went to York University for grad school, so we had a very strong union, QP 3903, and staged a couple of strikes during my time there. And by the time I got to my job at Wilfrid Laurier University, I became involved in the union there, right from day one, essentially.
Okay, that's great. Siobhan, do you want to go next?
I come out of IATSE. I was a stage and film technician, and my attraction to work in the arts started really early in my life, and all of that was underpinned with an understanding. Again, it wasn't explicit, but I grew up in Calgary, but I always knew a union meant a good job. And so, my first picket line would have been, I would have been in my 9 or 10, right? And that in the 80s is when there was quite a movement in Alberta, when, about to get into Klein, and Pocklington was going after, the meat packers. And it was really just fundamentally about the fairness. And then, as anybody knows, right, you get active, you volunteer in a committee, then you're on all the committees, or then you're on the executive. And but that it was all underpinned with, one is, I always understood that, unions were about fairness. And then also, I never got away with, raising a concern in my house without the answer being, well, maybe you should deal with it and do something about it. And so those two things together have pushed me through. And and I'm very privileged to get to do what I do and push for fairness. But yeah, it's just been a lifetime of understanding unions are good jobs.
Great. Thank you. Patrick.
Yeah, I guess different than the other guests. I didn't have that experience at a young age at all. I actually grew up in a right to work state in Georgia, and where you didn't know unions were a good job because no one was in them, or very few folks were, including any of my family. And then I was living in California, doing some work in tenant organizing and climate action in the late 90s, and started to kind of work with unions to actually build power for workers and for the movement that we were in around affordable housing at the time. And so when I moved to Canada, I certainly started to get involved with UFCW, and it really led to where I am now. And like whether it's those three experiences were all very different between laws in Georgia, laws in California, and laws in British Columbia.
I'm sure that's very interesting, actually. All right. Thank you. Now that we know how you all came here, and since the backdrop is something that happened a long time ago, and this is a tough question I'm going to ask you next, as you look back 150 years ago and over the years, just as a general statement, and we're going to get into more specifics, would you say that there's been an important, a great evolution in terms of the labor movement? Have we come far? I mean, maybe compared to other countries. I don't know how you would sort of want to answer this one. I'll let you be creative with it. Have we come far enough? Have we not come far enough? And again, like I said, we'll get into more specifics shortly. Anyone want to jump onto that question? I can choose.
I'll jump into it.
Okay.
I mean, certainly as a private sector, largely private sector union, I mean, we have density problems in the private sector. So when we talk about if we come far enough, we need to come further in terms of building density for sure. And I think that, in a very good way right now, and I know we'll get into this, or I'll certainly intend to get into it later, but I mean, I think Gen Z is an organizing generation, and we're seeing that. And so we're seeing the ability for to come much further. And unequivocally, COVID, I wouldn't say that COVID was hard on frontline workers. COVID is still hard on frontline workers. And so that really is the ability to I think to change that question from have we come far enough? No, but we really have an opportunity right now, and we're seeing that as a local for sure.
Okay. Anyone else? Siobhan?
Yeah, I mean, 150 years, and maybe Robert's probably in a better position to really reflect on that, but it is a long time. And I think, things have changed. But at the heart of it really was, because there's been social changes, there's been societal changes, what family means has changed, and what a job is and what the conditions of work has changed. And so in some ways, I feel like the labor movement hasn't changed in its fundamental response to that, in terms of we're trying to make jobs better, we're trying to make society better, we're trying to make families experience better, and so that kind of becomes the follow. But I think when we go through, we see the ebb and flow of how social unions are at the forefront, or when they're going back. And I think it's reflective of governments. And I absolutely agree with you, Patrick, right? We need to increase density. And, all of us who are, get to do this work know that that's just not by accident, right? These are laws that are against it. And so, yes, the fundamental, rights at work, whether it's minimum wage and occupational health and safety conditions and all of that, we have pushed and have to keep changing how we describe that because work has changed. But we are social unions, and especially at the Canadian Labour Congress, that's what we push for, because it's about everybody. It's about all working conditions. And so hopefully we can, continue to play that evening of the, the power scales, if you will, as we move forward and trying to find and redefine what we need to do for workers.
Thank you. Rob, historian's perspective.
I'd say in some ways it's the same, and some ways it's evolved, right? The 9 hours movement started by workers asking the question, what's fair? And I think that that's a central question for workers today as well. At the time, they were asking that question about an economic system called capitalism, which we're used to. We, a lot of people just understand that's the way things are. It's a static background to our lives. But at the time, it was a new economic system that was taking shape. And so workers, the 9 Hours movement was really workers debating amongst themselves, with their employers, with politicians about what should this new system look like? What's fair within it? What brings us all forward in the most socially positive way? And there's lots of similarities to that today. I think in the intervening time between then and now, we've seen a variety of ebbs and flows of the labor movement, and it's often in reaction to the way that capitalist system isn't that static thing, that unchanging thing. In fact, it changes again and again and again. It changes with technology. It changes with the ups and downs of the economy and things like that. So we've had big upsurges of particular types of labor unrest, like after the First World War, the workers' revolt that stretched across the country. People mostly remember the Winnipeg general strike of that time, but also after the Second World War, with a big wave of strikes in 1946 that established industrial unionism in Canada. And I think today we're dealing with a type of capitalism that's evolved. A lot of people call it neoliberal capitalism, and has created a lot of disparity in wealth and income. It has created a lot of jobs that are precarious, and a perception of great unfairness amongst many working people. Thank
you. And I think you actually touched upon what maybe you would answer in the next question, and we'll see in a second. I'm curious whether there is in your head, like we're sort of, this is the backdrop, we are talking about major milestones in labor movement, and I'm wondering perhaps a more recent or, a milestone in the labor movement that you would say have been incredibly significant for the evolution of this movement. And you mentioned the Winnipeg strike. I'm not sure if you would say that as one of them, but if anyone wants to, discuss what milestones you think has been particularly significant, what would you say?
Yeah, I guess it's like, how recent does recent mean?
Right.
Like the first coming to mind, of course, is what happened in Ontario with the education workers, and the response to that attack on fundamental rights. And it's not isolated, right? There's been, like the underfunding of those jobs, or this whole system, quite honestly. And then those jobs kind of bearing the brunt of that. They're low paid. We take great pride in our public school and education system, yet but not supporting it. And so those workers had kind of like, it was a pressure point of like, wait a minute, you can't now say we don't have rights and you can't come after. And that was great that they stood up. And then what was even better was everybody stood beside them and said, yeah, because if you're going to come after one of us, you're coming after all of us. And I think to a little extent, some of the response was surprised. Now, when you spend your life in meetings talking about solidarity, it wasn't a total surprise. But at the same time, when you look historically, it's like, right, it doesn't always look that way to the outside. And so I think that is a pivotal moment for us to remember the power we have when we work together. And so, for those education workers there, but I think there's constant like responses that we see in the labor movement that are impressive, and not all of them are as, like the Winnipeg, strike, general strike. Everybody's learned about that. That is such a pivotal moment, not just in labor history, but in Canadian history. And so, yeah, but for most recently, I think, that power of people coming together around that issue that was, attacking education workers, but attacking all workers.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and I'll leave it to the Robert, who will know far more of the history. But I mean, I think one thing that will be really interesting is that, like, the history that we're living in right now of how workers are coming out of a pandemic, and really like not just the sickness and the kind of the hardship that came with it, but I mean, one thing we saw, particularly in grocery stores, is health and safety committees that, for all practical purposes, were not that engaged, became incredibly engaged in health and safety at their workplace. Young workers with a lot of seniority, became engaged in talking about health and safety in their workplace. Whether that was around distancing or masks, but it's continued sense. We're as exhausted as frontline workers are, they're still very engaged in health and safety conversations. And I think that the very recent history in this case might really be that we do see a different conversation around how workers are involved in health and safety at their work site, and particularly, as I said, what we're seeing in some of the grocery sector.
Thank you. Rob?
Well, if we're talking about milestones in the labor movement, I'll start briefly where the other two panelists started, which is the education workers. Like the contemporary situation is really, I think, an important point in Canadian labor history. The whole 39K is not enough. The resonance that had, and I've been involved in the labor movement since the early 90s, including the Ontario Days of Action against Mike Harris. When a general strike was called for this time, it was the first time in my life that I've ever really felt this could happen. This is, we're right on the edge of it. It didn't. The government backed down. But I think this is going to be something we look back on and really see some significance around. But I think the other point to me is after the Second World War, there was, people came back from war. We had the same kind of situation as we have today, great disparities of wealth, capitalist profiteering, while workers went off and fought and died in battle. Then they came back to workplaces in that they found very unfair, and they stood up for that. That strike centered in a bunch of communities, particularly in Hamilton, Ontario, with strikes in the steel industry, the rubber industry, the electrical industry. But what ended up coming out of that was sort of the legal framework of unions. These new unions that had been formed around that time, industrial unions, were had a legal existence, and they had legal frameworks around how to negotiate and enforce contracts, how to run grievance systems, and things like that. And I think that's partly what Patrick is referring to when he talks about a decline in, say, union density in the private sector is that comes from that period. But that period is a mixed bag. I mean, anyone who's been, in a leadership position in a union knows that our legal protections on the one hand are great and provide us a lot of power, but on the other hand, they often feel very constraining and limiting. And that comes out of that period as well. But I do think that period still serves as an example to people of the power that it's possible for working people to have if they join together.
Thank you. I've been reading that some say the greatest period for the labor movement was the 70s and 80s, but then there was a bit of a dip, perhaps, and then there was a resurgence since the pandemic. That's sort of the take that I've got from reading different articles recently. Right or wrong, I'm not sure. Do you agree? I'm certainly not the one that could make that opinion. So wondering what you feel about that, what I've been taking away from the articles that I've been reading lately. And you did touch upon it. If you don't want to get into it again, Patrick, do you want to say anything about it?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. No, because you mentioned the pandemics. I'm like, I don't want you to repeat yourself, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, as a good friend of mine says, these are the good old days. And so when we talk about like what was the 70s and 80s and a greatest period for the labor movement, I think absolutely we have we're either there or we have the ability to be there right now. And so I mean, I guess history will show if it's true or not. But I mean, just one small example, we're going into bargaining with Save On Foods, which is a large grocery store in Western Canada. And we had over 5,000 members submit bargaining survey proposals. And so, I mean, when you have that kind of engagement, it shows that there certainly is a resurgence of workers being involved in their union. And ultimately, that's how you that's how you have a larger resurgence. And so I absolutely think that there's the ability to do that right now. And then I certainly we'll talk about it later, the ability to organize non-union workers and workers really seeing their value to take that power.
Okay. And do you want to address the second part of the question, which is why do you think that is, or you want to get to that later too? Because it's kind of obvious you did sort of mention it, but I'm curious what your take on. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're folks are facing in a crazy cost of living, certainly in British Columbia, but across Canada. And so, I mean, I think out of pure necessity, people are taking on the fact that they need to engage in conversations to get more wages. And then, whether it's, long periods of low pay, of minimum wages that really are poverty wages, that that the idea that how do you fight for more, and that joining a union or being a part of your union is the way that you do that. So I really think that just purely cost of living, and I love some of the stuff that the CLC is doing around cost of living and how it compares to corporate profits right now, because it resonates to the worker for sure.
Absolutely. Siobhan?
And it's out of control. like this
exactly.
like this greed, right? This greedflation. And and then of course there's periods of what often get defined is as prosperity, but it's prosperity for a few. And right now I think it is just so awful. After going through a period which was really like, what were we talking about? Is that we're in this together and we're all, we're going to get through this together and we just have to help each other. And then you find out, no, there's a whole bunch of people profiteering off the backs of workers who have really been the ones showing up. Patrick, obviously your members constantly. And so, in terms of like, how does this compare to the 70s, 80s, and is it better? We have to remember always is that there was wins and victories, and the labor movement does come together when there's a big pressure. And as we got into that really neoliberal idea, they had to come together. But it also wasn't a great time for all people in unions and all people seeing themselves in unions, right? Sure, in the 70s is when we got maternity and parental leave, which was a big union fight, and it was huge in terms of equality and equity, especially as it pertains to women. But so that's why we have to learn and adapt, right? And as we started this conversation, which is what hasn't changed is why we're there, but what needs to change is that constant describing like how we do that and responding. And so I do think we are in a moment that people are seeing the solution. I think, anybody who is organized in a union, often when people look to a union to maybe help them is when they're going through a troubled time. It's not sometimes how it gets described. I mean, very rarely do I hear from people that it's about pure wages. It's about all of it, right? It's about the health and safety. It's about scheduling. It's about like they have solutions to problems in the workplace, but they're not being heard. And right now that's what's happening. We see whether it's banks or CEOs making an unbelievable amount of profit. And yet our day-to-day lives, people are making decisions not to have certain types of food because they can't afford it. That doesn't make sense. And we know that unions are the solution, but I mean, Patrick, we're seeing the same thing across the country, which is Gen Zs and younger people are going, the solution is a union. So how do I get involved? And of course, there's the bigger name ones, right? We're seeing whether it's around Amazon, Starbucks, the Sephora here in BC that unionized, and which is really exciting. And then, of course, all of us have to turn around and go, why is it so challenging and difficult that these workers have access to the union they want? And so we need to change that work. But yeah, I mean, we have so many victories and it changes over time what we need to do. And so we are in a moment, and and like everything that we've won in the past is that it's not a given, because sometimes the quiet times for the movement is because we've been holding on really tight to not lose it. And I come from Alberta, and a lot of effort was spent in many years to ensure that those minimum things, that we didn't lose them, but that doesn't look like a victory. That just like that, it's just a lot of effort to go through there. And we're seeing it with our EI system, right? Like we saw that during COVID, right? That's a huge victory for workers in Canada, was when we got our, used to be the unemployment system, but the EI system. And but we fight every day to make sure that it's still reflective of what workers need now. So anyways, there's a whole bunch of examples about what we need to do or where we're going.
We're gonna get to that. Thank you. Thank you. Rob, would you like to add anything to that? Or
Yeah, I'd just expand on what Siobhan was talking about. That the post-Second World War labor movement that I was talking about, it rose to some pretty impressive heights of strength. But really, if you look at its membership, it was very male and it was very white in its complexion. By the 50s and 60s, there's more women unionists starting to get involved, and that ramps up. But that's a big difference to today. I mean, if you just look up any sort of major union website and click around in their campaigns or their committees or something like that, and you will see how unions are concerned with women, with LGBTQ2S plus workers, with indigenous workers, with racialized workers, and the arms have been opened much more widely to bring a much more diverse and reflective crowd of working people into the fold. Coming out of the pandemic, I mean, this is quite a moment in time. In addition to what Patrick and Siobhan were talking about, about inflation and all that sort of stuff, we have a labor market where workers have relatively more power than they've had in the past. But we also have a situation where even getting what in people's minds would seem like a high hourly wage 2 or 3 years ago isn't enough to pull through. I live in Hamilton, and my son just went and rented his first 2-bedroom apartment with his partner, and you can't find anything for under $2,000, right? So I was, involved in the 15 and Fairness campaign some years back, and $15 an hour seemed like, an aspirational goal then, and already that's behind us. So we have to keep on fighting, but we also have to realize that, like at any other point in history, while we're banding together and gaining strength, we also face a mounting opposition, right? And I completely agree. It's Gen Z, it's young workers that appear to hold a lot of the answers to this, particularly when we live in a society where older folks older than them seem to be so divided between left and right that my fingers are crossed.
And good. I think all of our fingers are crossed and toes included. But which brings me to, and maybe not, I'm curious what you will say about this. What is the greatest strength, in your opinion, that the labor movement brings to the table? And then we'll talk about the greatest challenges. Yeah. So who wants to go further about the strength? Maybe it is the young people. I don't know. What would anyone? Patrick?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the labor movement whole, that the greatest strength that the labor movement brings and always brought is not just how do you help union members, but how do you help workers? And so how do you engage workers as a whole more broadly in fighting for higher minimum wages, fighting to be a part of and to change climate change and to be a part of climate action. And so I think that there's so much of that is how does labor movement bring in not just their members, but the workers as a whole. But on a kind of a bargaining perspective and things that really impact us at the table, or the ability to organize. And I think Robert really touched on it, is the worker shortages that have existed really have allowed workers to know their power, to be able to take their labor to another company more easily. And so, therefore, what we've seen in organizing drives and what's therefore led to power in them is workers are saying, I want to stay here, and therefore I want to make it better. And so therefore I want to form a union, or we want to demonstrate our power. And it's a choice, because we want to stay here instead of, I feel stuck at this job, how do I make it better? And it's a really, really big difference in terms of what we're seeing, particularly in kind of industries that already kind of have high turnover, where now they have like extremely high turnover or have over the last year. And so that decision for workers to say, I want to make this place better, not I'm stuck here and I have to make it better.
Thank you. Siobhan, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really our power of solidarity, right? Like that coming together that we have, because we always say that people are our power, but it truly is, because that's how we can take action and like counter that balance. It's also the knowledge, right? Like, I mean, ask workers about how we can do a transition to zero carbon economy, right? Like, ask workers how we can deal with technology changes, and and ask workers about how, because the rules of work have changed, like whether it's like where we do work or the hours that people want us to work to, to kind of define what the job is. And I think that expertise is really impressive. But yeah, that fundamental like idea of solidarity is how we're going to win these fights. And yeah, so I really think that is the power of the movement.
Great. Rob?
I couldn't agree more with what I'm hearing, right? What we're seeing is a broadening out of issues that are included in the labor movement, and people who are included in the labor movement. There used to be a style of unionism that really focused tightly on negotiating contracts, administering grievances, and things like that were, very business oriented and didn't reach out very well. And I'm incredibly encouraged by what I'm seeing in the labor movement. I mean, I think of my own community, Hamilton. Our labor council has all sorts of folks coming to meetings. If you go to, it's reached out to social justice organizations across the city, environmental organizations that haven't traditionally been part of the conception of the labor movement. If you go to an environmental rally, if you go to an Indigenous rights rally, all of these things, you find, huge numbers of supporters from the labor movement, and vice versa, right? So there's a coming together, and it's some people my age doing that, but also I think it's skewing towards younger workers as well, who are doing this really inspiring work that will hopefully lead to positive change.
And we are going to touch upon some of the young people in a second. I just wanted to, I wanted to address the challenges. So what would you say are the greatest challenges, or one really significant challenge, or a few, whatever you'd like to mention in terms of what might be in the way of all that positive, energy that you all mentioned?
Yeah, I think there's lots of challenges in front of us. In thinking about like the disinformation that is being used by politicians, and using it in a way to try and take rights away, and unapologetically. I think that is challenging. It's extremely challenging to break through when they can, use a phrase that has no context, makes no sense, doesn't help us, and then us trying to get that change, which is, why our work is on the ground. I mean, right now with, when we talk about this greedflation, right, we have a Bank of Canada that is not acting in a way that is helping, regular folks. And that again is a huge challenge for us, because, whether it's going into recession or just allowing that unchecked, capitalism to like kind of grow is a huge challenge for working people, because, that greed and profit idea is on the backs of workers, and so that becomes a challenge, and it becomes a challenge to get that information out. And we do have the solutions, but it's easy to say this is the solution, but we know the amount of work that's going to take to roll that out is going to be, it's a big task. I feel we have the ingredients, but those are definitely challenges that I think we're facing right now.
Patrick, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll on a very different level. I mean, one of the challenges, and certainly our president Kim Novak talks about this a lot, and our members really do, is the challenge that frontline workers take on like just dealing with being the I'd say unacceptable behavior from customers, like where they really, during the masks, they were the problem. They were getting yelled at because they had the masks on. Grocery store workers, they don't make lettuce cost $6 a head of lettuce, but then they suddenly like get blamed for it, and like people are like customers actively like mad at them because grocery prices are so high. And so, I mean, it's not by no means a big legislative challenge, but it really is a challenge that workers face, that they're the frustration that society feels is sometimes some individuals take that out, and then certainly the racism and the xenophobia and the ageism that you see on frontline workers. And so the reason why I think it's one of the greatest challenges is it's exhausting. And so you deal with this at work, and then the last thing you want to do is then go get involved in how you be a part of legislative change. You just want to go home and rest. And so I do think that just that as society we're tired. And how do we as unions really help support workers and get through that to really make those important legislative changes that Siobhan spoke about.
Thank you. Rob?
When I think about Patrick's point about frontline workers being held to account for the price of lettuce, and what Siobhan said about disinformation being everywhere right now, I look at one of our greatest challenges as a very small group of people who have accumulated huge amounts of financial resources and don't really care about just general everyday people like you and I. And they use that money to fund think tanks, spread disinformation, to push certain political points of view, which are self-serving for them, to put politicians in their pocket, and to create these sort of ideologies which concentrate on the individual and individual rights rather than what's good for all of us. What can we do to pull each other up? And that's I think one of the central things that we need to focus on. And I think a lot of people are turning their attentions towards that right now.
Thank you. I'm just curious because Siobhan, you did bring this up at the top of the conversation. What about the challenge of the notwithstanding clause or politicians that might put it to use? I mean, do we want to even get into that? I mean, I can't help but think like that's like, it was a huge challenge recently, although people stood up to it, right? And I don't know if he'll be using that again, but I wonder, like, are the laws, they should be supporting us. Sometimes the laws can do the opposite.
Yeah, and I guess to me that's also like, I think there was a little bit of like, that's never what that was intended for. But, they had a goal, which was to, fundamentally take that way. So they found a tool that existed. And just because it wasn't what it was intended for, it was written in a way that that's what they could use. And so will it come up again? Possibly. But the attack on workers will come up again. Right. And what it looks like, I mean, we can guess what it's going to look like. Maybe it's a notwithstanding clause, but that attack will always come up when we have politicians who, fundamentally don't think they need to protect the rights of workers. And so, yeah, and I think that's why we need to be responsive and paying attention, and because, yeah, they'll find their way, and that may change, but it doesn't change the fact that it's just because, yeah, they're just not supportive. And I think what you were saying, Rob, about like it just not being this thinking of that it has to be better for everybody, right? It's okay that it's better for a few.
Right. Okay. I just needed to put that out there because I wasn't going to say anything, but you had mentioned it at the top. So I'm like, well, she put it out there. I'm going to bring it up. Okay. So next question, we touched upon this too, the young people, but it's not only young people, but I've just been noticing like, I did do a digital story. We do digital stories as well as these panel conversations. I did it with one of the young people who was an organizer. And so we've noticing, like in doing my research, that there are more and more young people that are taking a stand. Maybe they always were, though, and that's what I'm going to sort of go for here. So you saw the Sephora in Kamloops, Starbucks in Victoria. There's plenty of other examples. number one, what accounts for their success in your opinion? And is this a sign of the future face of labor activism, or has this always been the face of labor activism? A lot of like elements to these questions that I'm throwing at you, but I am really curious what you think about the young folks out there. Anyone?
I mean, I think it's really exciting to see what's going on. It's a variety of new tactics and enthusiasm, I think, combined, which are adding up to something really great. And new methods of organizing of, if you look at the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island, of folks on the shop floor doing that deep organizing amongst their co-workers and slowly building power in the workforce and heading towards unionization. There are a variety of new organizing, well, not all that new, but new and adapted organizing tactics that, everyone from trying to organize Amazon to, you look in Ontario, there's an organization that used to be called 15 in Fairness. Now it's called Justice for Workers. It's really inspiring the way that these organizations and the people involved are reaching out, building community, involving people. And I think that's where a lot of our potential success is going to lie.
Okay. And are those primarily younger people or generally speaking? Because I'm just curious if that's
it's a mix.
Okay.
But say in Hamilton, I'm involved in Justice for Workers, but it's mainly younger people. And I enjoy, as a union president of a traditional union who has to get in there and figure things out and make decisions, it's nice to go and just be around the positive energy of those folks, right, and take a back seat and watch them make great decisions and make really important strides.
Great. Thank you. Siobhan, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I'll share the energy. I think is fantastic. And when we look at that, like under 35, I think it polls at about like 50% say they want to be part of a union. But the reality is that the unionization rates at that age are half of what the general population is. And so that's also something to consider when we think, why, right? Like, is it because the type of jobs? Is it the workplaces? But this energy of organizing, I think, is great. And yes, it's lots of people, but there is about it being about the, I guess, Gen Zs in Canada, but the Gen Zs, coming at it with this energy. But because, like, if we don't improve things, they're going to be, carrying more of the brunt of it, whether it's on climate, whether it's on, what do jobs look like in the future because of technology and for other changes. And so, yeah, like I do think we're at this moment where we need to listen and be a part of it and make sure that, we're assisting in the success of that, because there is a real potential that we will, get the unionization rates higher the way they should be for workers. But it is coming from that, I think, that energy of organizing and not accepting like, and Patrick, you talked about it. It's like, it's not just, I'm going to change my job. It's like, no, I want this job, but I want this job to be better. And I think that's exciting for us.
Yeah. Patrick, what would you say? I mean, and yeah, specifically, is there a younger push, the younger people pushing harder, or is it, because I'm not so sure that's true, actually. It seems like it's not necessarily the case, but we do see more and more examples of it. But, what do you think it accounts for something?
Sure. Yeah, I absolutely, in non-union shops organizing, it definitely accounts for it from certainly within our local, but even what we've seen. We are very fortunate in BC to have legislative changes that have with card check that have led organizing be much more fair to workers and in truth to make that process less intimidating for younger workers or folks that aren't necessarily don't really necessarily know what a union is. That first 2 weeks of it doesn't have to be like absolute war with your employer. So I think that's a really a big thing. Yeah. But I mean, I think that younger workers have been totally inspiring to me lately, and in just some of the stuff that we've seen. And like, do they need better wages and benefits? Of course, like, absolutely. But you're seeing that folks are organizing for kind of more kind of almost like more traditional union values of solidarity, of standing up against bullying and harassment. I was actually bargaining at a table yesterday for a cannabis dispensary, and the committee was so focused on the fact that the dress code really was not inclusive for non-binary folks. Like that is what we were talking about. We were not talking about wages and benefits. Hope the employer doesn't hear me say that. We were really talking about solidarity with folks. And so I think that's something that has been super inspiring. But then you look at our membership, it's a very young membership, like over half our members are under 30. How are they engaging in their existing union? And that's what we do need to do better as a movement. So we're seeing non-union folks want to join a union, but are unionized folks that are young engaging. And that's what, certainly we're working very hard on. And I'd say, like any organizing you do, like you need to meet people where they're at. And, people are at their phones. So you're seeing organizing on WhatsApp, you're seeing organizing on, in digital groups. And when you show up and say, hey, you want to go have a union meeting in the basement of the Ramada Inn, they don't show up, but they do show up when you say you want to start a WhatsApp group, and they show up with good ideas and they're engaged. So I think that's what we need to make sure we're doing.
You know where to find them. You have to go where they are, right? We made it to the last question. We didn't go over time. I'm so excited. I kind of feel the last question might also be a little repetitive, but I'm just going to put it out there. If anyone has anything else they want to say that they didn't have a chance to say, we'll sort of incorporate it into this last one. What's your hope for the future of the labor movement? What must happen to get it there? And again, you each sort of touched upon these elements before, but if there's anything else you haven't had a chance to say, this is your chance. The last question.
Yeah, I think we've dabbled on a few things that, are there. And I think it's the diversity of leadership, reflecting the diversity of our members, and diversity in all its ways, right? Like that's gender, that's, racialized workers, that's also jobs, right? Like the type of work people come out of, the type of experiences they bring to the table, and all of that to drive the unity that I think needs to happen, and that us finding abilities to constantly come together, because the future has to be around us dealing with this affordability crisis. I also think we have a lot of work to do on the care economy, to identify those jobs, which are traditionally not done, quite honestly, by those who were unionized in the 50s. And to value care work and to raise it up to the standard that recognizes how important it is to our society. And we can deal with crises if we have, or crises, or I always add an extra syllable to that word, but we can deal with them if we have that unity and that solidarity, and not lose that fundamental reason of why we're doing this work and why the movement needs to exist. Because it's not just about staying relevant. It is to constantly be, the promoting change and, making sure that change and that change becomes positive. And and then it always gets back to the solidarity being our superpower. And so, but that takes effort and intention. And I think we can do it. But we all need to be on board to do it.
Thank you. Well said. Anyone else would like to add
something? Sure. I mean, I think a hope is that in order to have true climate action, we know that workers have to be a part of it. And so that can't happen unless they're together. And so, I mean, I think really a hope of the future of the labor movement is that we really those two movements are one, and I think that is a necessity for this planet and the workers that are here. And then I guess another hope is that solidarity can be fun, and ultimately that we have fun along the way, and that's where we really can engage folks and get wins. Like there are big struggles, there's big fights, both at workplaces and legislatively, but that we can actually have fun in that process, because it brings people to the table.
Thank you. Like we're having fun here.
Yeah, like it's okay to have fun.
Rob?
I agree with the other panelists on this one. I want to see a labor movement that reaches out and encompasses everyone, and that, as Patrick says, identifies causes not traditionally seen as labor movement causes as part of its interests and supports those causes. But when you ask that question, I actually think back to the 9 Hours movement, because the leader of that movement, James Ryan, came over as a railway worker with experience in England before he got here. And there's some evidence that he was affiliated with the Communist International over there. And so he brought those ideas into the conversation about the 9 Hour movement. And there were sort of two broad camps that were at odds with each other in that conversation. There were the ones like him that said we need to overthrow this evil new system. And then there were those that said we just need to find ways of making it more fair for us to get our place in those systems. So I think we're still, anyone involved in unionizing in the union movement today, I think, encounters the conflict of those two questions going forward. So we need to, we need to come to a real assessment. Which of those ways that we need to go? Can we change the present system enough, or do we have to have change that's more fundamental to serve the vast majority of society better going forward?
Well, a lot to think about, which is what this was all about. So thank you for that, Rob. It was a great way to end our conversation. I can't believe we got through it all. I'm so excited. Okay. So anyway, thank you so much. I know I took enough of your time already, so I'm not going to sit here with all the thank yous, but I do want to thank you so much for taking the time and for adding your opinions and thoughts. And it really is an important conversation, and I'm glad we're having it.